So my session, and thank you to Team Kinetic and the team for inviting me. My session is called Enhancing Volunteer Retention through Participatory Evaluation. And really what Chris had asked me to talk about was how we might both at the same time empower volunteers and potentially enhance retention by involving them in capturing the social impact of their efforts. And I did some work on this basically within For Glasgow Life, and now doing some more of that for Volunteer Glasgow, and by applying a participatory design methodology to qualitatively evaluate the social impact of Glasgow Life's volunteer-led services, specifically on the people who actually use them. So an overview of what we're going to do is that I'll just sort of touch a little bit on what and how we already now tend to measure the impact of volunteering in the sector and the pros and cons of that. And that's probably where Chris was referring to how maybe Will and I differ in our approaches, but have the same passion about how to measure things. And then I'll go into this new sort of qualitative approach that I designed to evaluate the social impact that also empowers the volunteers. And then we'll consider some implications for volunteer involving organisations and the sector. And then I really want to have a discussion because this is quite new. This is something that I don't even have all the results of myself yet because it was just done last year. And I'd love to sort of get into discussion with you. And I realise what I've done is I've said, please put questions in the chat as we go, which still please do, even though I can't see it, because if there's really sort of questions about something I say that's not clear or something about the methodology, anything like that, just put in your questions and then we'll get to them at the end. And then it just means you won't have forgotten. So please feel free. And then at the same time, I do have a strong Scottish accent and the tendency to talk fast. So please interrupt me and tell me if I'm doing any of those things or if anything is not clear. So why involve volunteers in impact measurement? And so, I mean, the top reason why volunteers even get involved in volunteering for any organisation is that they actually want to make an impact, right? They want to improve things, help people. They want to actually. But what if they don't see that impact? And the thing is, what we tend to measure when in this sector and more broadly, and of course this is a generalization, but it's based on my experience in the sector and the research that I did in the last couple of years on this, is that we kind of tend to measure more, there's just much more information and focus on the impact for volunteers themselves and way less on the actual impact on communities, unless you go really sort of like high scale, big kind of like research that obviously normal size organizations or small, what I like to call small and medium charities, so SMCs, usually obviously wouldn't be able to do, and it wouldn't actually serve their purpose anyway. And we also tend to sort of measure and report back more on activities rather than being an outcomes. So things like, the number of people that you've managed to serve through a volunteering service versus what was the actual outcome for those people that were accessing that service? How did it change their lives or support them or enhance things? And we also have a much bigger tendency to do more quantitative approaches. So we like to count, we like to make numerical, we like to turn it into pounds and numbers and different things like that. And we tend to do that mostly compared to any sort of qualitative things that we do. And when we do qualitative, it does tend to be, which I think are great, so like, case studies and quotes and different things like that, even testimonials. And at the same time, a lot of sort of the researchers, academics, and even the sort of decision makers, they kind of say, well, that's just, for them, it seems a bit anecdotal that it got one story, a couple of quotes, etc. You're trying to sort of build that story around maybe some quantitative stats. And so in the context of that, and as well, especially in the past sort of 10 to 20 years, and as I'm sure will be talking about right now in the other session, is that there has also been a growth in sort of really monetizing and kind of trying to find economic ways to sort of measure social value. And so even way back in the financial crisis of 2008-9, there was a big sort of then push to have like, social return on investment in terms of the value of the benefits based on the costs of them, or a general cost benefit analysis. Then there came in 2012, I think it was, the UK did the Social Value Act. And this was at the beginning, it was very much for basically making sure that public and private contracting had a certain percentage that would go to social value. But the way they measure that is also just number of initiatives for the community and pounds donations and also number of volunteer hours. And then there's also the Wellbe, which is a kind of they take social outcomes converted and you sort of convert them into a sort of pounds value based on like sort of social outcomes data sets, but then still turning them into sort of a pound measure. And that's what Will would be talking about, I'm sure, in his session. And so I think the issue with this is there's pros and cons to sort of looking at things in the way that we do, which is this tendency towards numbers, tendency towards economic, and tendency towards measuring activities and focus on volunteers. But the pros of doing it in that way, obviously, is it's a lot easier to count. It does allow for bigger aggregation sort of across the board, which is obviously very difficult to do with the type of social services that we all provide, right? Because they're so wide and they're so complex. And it does allow for some comparison. And I guess it can seem a little bit like, a refutable kind of hard fact. You can't really argue with the numbers. And it might also feel like a sort of very rational way to look at something, very kind of distant and not too biased. And many people also talk about it really being able to speak the language of funders so that you can have a much more sort of convincing argument around, why should you invest more in volunteering, for example, at the higher level. But the cons, and I think, and this is where I would invite people to sort of stop and think about how we talk about volunteering, how we talk about the impact of it, and how the language that we use and the voice that we use actually impacts people's perception of it and also the investment in it. And I think this nice quote kind of sums it up very nicely, which says, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted actually counts. And I think that because we have a tendency to focus more on the sort of quantitative side or activities based, it makes a lot of our work very invisible in the context of really being able to understand what we do, why we do it, and the impact that it's having and why it's so important. And this is really important in the context of the funding issues we have, the reduction or the decline in volunteering, more individualistic kind of ways of working with less public engagement, mistrust between the public and government, etc. And I feel that it adds a lot to that space when we're not able to sort of qualify our value but we can quantify it quite well. And the thing is as well, and I think this is also a bit worrying, is that there's a lot of cognitive biases out there that we have as humans because we are just human. But actually thinking about money makes us less pro-social. And this is a bit worrying because if we are saying, okay, we've got a stat that says, in 2.3 billion pounds is the net worth of volunteering in Scotland, for example, and we think that might be useful to help decision makers think about how to move around the accounts, it might actually not be, because this is something that might just be a little bit like damaging to the idea of trying to really convince someone that the work we do is actually important. For very social reasons. And then overall, it means that we're just missing the bigger picture of things. We're not capturing the real rich kind of social aspects of what we're doing with our work. So what I was thinking when I started doing this research and I started working with Glasgow Life on this, and this was all part of doing some further higher education. I did another master in design innovation at the Glasgow School of Art, and I wanted to understand how we could creatively and more sort of qualitatively better capture the social value of what we do in the volunteering sector, while at the same time empowering volunteers to be involved in that process so that they can also see the impact of their efforts. And again, knowing that that's so important, that they sign up because they want to make an impact and they want to know the impact they're having. And given that we're talking about, going beyond recruitment of volunteers, but how to retain them and have them have that positive experience, I was thinking that this could be quite a good way to sort of really tackle both of those things at the same time. So what I did was this sort of participated design approach. So I did a qualitative based evaluation for Glasgow Life, and I did that through a bunch of different qualitative approaches. It was semi-structured interviews, observation, different generative sessions, engagement tools, ethnography, and I sort of borrowed from and developed my own methods from values-based evaluation, generative evaluation, and participatory evaluation. And I can explain a bit more detail of those things later if you want the details, but I'd rather get through the gist and then you can tell me what you might want to know more of. But the gist really is that by using participatory methods in this way, I was making the volunteers, and in this case, I basically did an overall evaluation of the 7 or 8 programs that Glasgow Life has that are volunteer led. And then I deep dived into one specific one, which was the Health Walk program. And so in this case, what I was doing was getting the volunteers of all these programs and then also the service users of one particular program, so these walkers, the ones that are participating in the health walks, as central to the process. So really enabling them to define the value and the benefit of that service. So more from a bottom-up approach, and also getting them to shape the tools and the frameworks that reflect their experiences and priorities. I also made sure that the volunteers were involved in designing the actual tools to measure the social impact. And at the same time, the methodology was prioritizing, of course, qualitative data. So really emphasizing not just, opinion surveys, so there was no surveys, but much more what is the lived experience of these people that are participating in this service, both the volunteer health walk leaders and also the people participating, the walkers. And then I made sure that the volunteers and staff were testing everything I was doing, validating the results that come out, and then able to sort of help me do the final design outcomes to provide Glasgow Life with a set of materials, etc. And I also actively participated in the walk myself as a part of ethnography to really, again, learn and understand the impact from the participants' perspective. So these are just a couple of photos of some of the creative fun that we had doing this. We had different games, we had different engagement sessions, interviews, and sort of really, I just tested it a lot of different ways to ask a lot of the same questions, which was, what is it you're getting out of being in this service, and why is that important to you, really? And of course, I did a typical sort of, qualitative analysis methods by doing an affinity mapping and a thematic analysis. Now, don't worry, you're not meant to be able to read this, but just to say, this is just a screenshot of some of the ways that I've been, ordering all of the data, coding it and understanding all that qualitative stuff. But the new thing, the thing that I did different, and the thing that makes this hopefully innovative, is that I also took all of the primary data from the walkers and the walk leaders and actually coded it as well against a set of values. And what I was trying to do was basically see, okay, so depending on what they're saying, what's the values that these actually correlate to, and what are the patterns within that? What's coming up most? What's most common? What's really, really coming out of that? And the really great thing about doing it this bottom-up approach was that we actually uncovered a lot more social impacts than what was already getting measured or even expected. So you can see here in this visual, it shows that the light pink, so the light pink bubbles are what was originally being measured. And so obviously health, because it's a health walk, and some learning around, where to walk and better walking routes. But everything else in the darker pink was all these other areas that they hadn't even thought of that were actually having an impact on the people participating in this service. Things like, connection and inclusion and confidence. And there was more than just this, but this was obviously the ones that were coming up to the point of saturation and having a pattern in the data. And they just hadn't foreseen any of this. And so on the basis of being able to paint a sort of richer picture, I could sort of reverse engineer then an evaluation framework that captured more of it in a more sort of social, holistic way. And so you have, the values here at the top, which were the eventual top 5 that came out most, and also that aligned with Glasgow Life's own overall values as an organisation. Then you have the clear outcomes and the results. And then, of course, the activity is the actual health walk itself. And I think which was really nice about the whole thing was that the biggest thing really was actually connection. And it wasn't just the connection in the sense that, so the outcome was that the health walks enhance the participants' social connections and involvement in society. So their social capital, which we know is super needed for many other things in general health and well-being. But it was specifically, obviously helping create new friendships and things like that. But it was even access to other events, access to other services, access to information they wouldn't have if they weren't participating in this group. And even then, at the same time, they were also getting connection and support in other daily life challenges and things. So that's just one example. I won't go through everything, but just to say that we found a really sort of interesting, structured and visual, but also very sort of qualitative way to kind of explain this. And then we could sort of then connect those into what was that contributing to in terms of national strategies on, for example, mental health, or the Let's Get Scotland Walking strategy, or even the Scottish National Performance Framework overall. And that's something that I think we often, I don't know if we take it for granted, but I think it says a lot when we can actually show how our work contributes to these bigger things and not just to the specific goal that we set ourselves for in a given project. And so that evaluation framework allowed me to deliver and to sort of design, again, with the staff, with the volunteers, a pack for the volunteers and a pack for the staff that would allow them to go and basically collect the data themselves and continue to do this every year as they want, also adapt it if they need to, and turn that into an actual social impact report, which was much more alive. And it had the quantitative data that they had from the survey, but also all the qualitative stuff in that sort of more, I mean, it kind of turned out like a little bit of these are just the excerpts, but a bit of a, between a zine and a kind of photo book. But the reason why it turned out also so visual and so full in this space was we also decided that the whole point of this was because we were doing it for the volunteers. And then they were going to use this to then maybe go to donors or others or change it or use the data in other ways. But principally what they wanted was to show the volunteers the impact that they were having. And so we tested that with them. We actually then went back after doing all that and said, okay, so here's the impact you're having. And let's talk about it with the volunteers and the walkers. And although at this point, because this is new, I don't yet have the data or the knowledge of like, is this really beneficial to make sure people are going to stay in an organization in terms of volunteer retention. I think it's got a lot of potential. And this is what I would really love to get your feedback on and your thoughts on, because I mean, here you can see just a couple of the quotes that we got from sort of testing it with them in that session. And, the walk leaders, so the volunteers, were really saying it was so, it was so special to them to sort of, to see this in this visual way, to understand the impact they were having. They wanted to get more copies. They wanted to share it with other people. And I think that was the thing. That was what we were going for. We wanted our volunteers to feel valued, to feel seen, for them to understand the impact they're having, and to get that joy out of actually knowing the impact that they were bringing to that particular service. And that definitely worked in that way. And I guess, like, at this point, I would definitely probably be on the opposite side of what probably Will is talking about right now, which is how to, how to sort of really show the economic argument for the economic value of volunteering. Because I also want to point out that the idea that we can sort of rationally make decisions and use cold hard facts and numbers is kind of a cultural mindset that we've actually been indoctrinated in, I would say, in terms of how we've been educated. And more recently, just as psychology has evolved in the past, 10, 15 years, there is now a complete understanding that feelings and experiences and all that sort of social aspect, all the sort of fluffy stuff, are absolutely innate to who we are as humans. And the thing is, thinking and acting without these is actually impossible. You can't have like a sort of hard rational decision. You're always going to be impacted by your emotions and what you think. And so why are we not talking much more emotionally and socially about the work that we do? Because the work that we do is emotional and it is social, and it goes beyond numbers. And so at the same time, there is also, I was really, and I was at a creative research methods conference the other week, and I was inspired by the fact that there's more and more movements in people, but also a call for, among academics, among governments, to sort of really recognise and bring to the fore people's lived experience and have that validated through their collective meaning making. And this idea, through the approach that I took, was to get the beneficiaries of the service to define it for themselves, and rather than it be decided sort of top down. And so it's not that the sort of like the idea and understanding of why it's important isn't there. There's lots of people pushing to do it. And the thing is, I do believe it's going to have implications for VIOs, right? Obviously for recruitment and retention, in the context of, if they're not seeing the difference they make, they won't stay. And actually, or the opposite, if they see even better and better understand and are more involved in making that difference and capturing that difference and helping with evaluation, then there's going to be so much more ownership and engagement, and the experience of that person is going to be much more different compared to other experiences. And especially considering, as I was saying, obviously volunteering is in decline, and enhancing that volunteer experience and maybe doing things a bit differently is what we need to make sure we are recruiting and retaining volunteers. And at the same time, there is this idea of the volunteer staff, the volunteer and the staff empowerment, because it is great if we can do big, long studies, like, long-term, longitudinal studies, capture all this data and insight at the big national levels. But the majority of us in our smaller organizations, what we need, or our job is to show the impact to our direct donors, to the people working with us, to our staff, so that they have purpose and they understand what it is they're contributing to. And also, of course, then the volunteers, and being able to capture what matters to them, your beneficiaries, your volunteers and staff, is just as important as capturing what the donor wants as well, if not more so, I would say. And potentially, what might be the implications for fundraising? The numbers do tell, but this really nice quote, I like it, but stories sell. And so, it's maybe not needing so much more quantitative data that we need, but more about all of this qualitative stuff that really can paint a telling story. And so what's stopping us though from doing this? Because there is already a lot of resources out there to actually do this in a qualitative way, but we just tend not to use them or do them. Lots of the experience and research was showing that, it's a lack of resources sometimes, whether it's financial or time, it's even a capacity. How do you deal with like qualitative data? It is a little bit different. It's a lot less, I would say it's not difficult, but that's easy for me to say, but it just takes a little bit more time probably than maybe counting some things in the way we normally do it. Also, volunteers do tend to play down their impact as well. So getting them on board and getting them to understand that their role in capturing that and observing that and seeing and defining and qualifying the difference is also a bit of a challenge. And also there is that more focus on the benefit for volunteers versus being able to really sort of change and focus on the impact on communities. There's also a lot of expectations that this kind of qualitative work will be extra work. And I guess to a certain extent, it might be a bit true if you don't already do things like that. But at the same time, by putting a little bit of effort in at the beginning, you could actually embed it into everything you're doing, which is how I did it with Glasgow Life. They don't have an M&E person, a monitoring evaluation person. They don't have any extra staff to do it, but we designed it in a way that it was already just taking all these different ways to capture data and showcase it was integrated into the yearly plan for doing different activities and different events. So it was actually feasible at zero extra cost. And the only extra cost would be if you wanted to print something out and actually print the reports, for example. We also have a lot of assumptions and biases, and I think I would say that we have an economic bias. We live in a sort of market society, and we just kind of, as our go-to is to count things and be really concrete and specific. But we also, I think, assume that this is what donors want to know and want to hear. And there is some research going on in the US that is actually showing that some donors actually don't, and some donors actually really do want to see the stories and understand the social stuff. And then, of course, maybe a big challenge might be that there's the regulations about the volunteer role. How much can volunteers or should volunteers do if you're getting them involved in monitoring or evaluation, etc., when obviously there are strict rules about not taking advantage of volunteers and that they shouldn't be doing roles that are specifically normally paid work roles. So I do think that's a thing. However, I'm going to jump out here now, and hopefully I'm going to stop presenting this. And before we chat, I want to do a really quick poll. And I know it's ironic that I'm kind of asking you to do a mini quiz, but I'm going to get you to do like a mini quiz. And it's just for a bit of a flash of like what you guys think, and we can sort of discuss it. So let me just go to that and get the link for you. Now this should be open and working. So I'm going to put it in, and thank you for I will check all the chats and things and the comments as you are doing this. It shouldn't take long. It's like 6 quick questions, mostly multiple choice. I've put the link in the chat. Can you just go ahead and open that, and just, it will just take you literally a couple of minutes, and then we can maybe have a chat around the results. And while you do that, and please let me know if you have any issues, and don't worry if you have any tech issues. It's not important if you can't finish it, but it's just to have an idea. And while you do that, I'm just checking if there were any specific questions. Yes, and thank you. Chris has said you would question irrefutable, which I did put in inverted commas for a very good reason, that whether the facts are relevant. And I think there is also a lot of when it comes to measuring, there's a whole side that we could talk about, which is what questions are you asking? Are they the right questions? Are they relevant? How are you getting the data? Or even is it, appropriate to ask certain questions? We've just got some funding for Glasgow, for Volunteer Glasgow, and the donor is asking us to ask actually very inappropriate questions to the young people that we support through befriending, and we had to push back because it's not the right approach. And absolutely, the worry around the charities are generally small and can't afford to employ academics or consultants is totally true, but I honestly did this at extremely little cost. And then I designed a way for them to be able to do it themselves and adapt it and etc. So it is definitely true. And I'm glad that you've also found like cheap solutions. And I'd love to hear more, Chris, about how you do that as well. So has everyone looked at and submitted at the end? By the way, you do have to click submit so we can see your answers in the overall thing. But can you give me some thumbs up?
I'm nearing the end, Joe. I don't know if it might be some
okay.
people.
No, take your time. It's just a few minutes. It shouldn't hopefully take too long. It was just a quick one to get an idea. And while people are finishing that, if anyone does want to come in with a specific question or any sort of thoughts already, please feel free to. We've got about 20 minutes left.
I've got a few, yeah. It's probably not me worth answering these because I'm not a volunteer manager, so I can answer some of these questions,
That's okay.
But some other ones it doesn't really attain to me. But I do have some questions. That was fascinating, by the way, what you covered so far. So how are you capturing the information then? What is from a practical perspective, how are you actually capturing the information from the volunteers?
So in terms of I was using interview. So when I was doing interviews, I was recording. When I was doing, I would design some of the more sort of creative ways to capture things, and I was getting them to vote using stickers or write down quotes that they remembered.
Saw that on the table, yeah. You had the little poster,
yeah. So lots of different ways, and I had to really tailor it to the specific project, right? Because it was a health walk, right? So you should have seen me. I was going on the walks with like all these clips and things that you could play with and do like as you were walking that were waterproof. But obviously that was me really sort of designing it to be in that walk with them. But then also we would do teas and coffees after. So sometimes we played some card games or some reflections with a cup of tea, and I would just record everything, either sort of like within a recording just on my phone or visually, so taking photos of the things that they were contributing to. And then I would take all of that data and put it into an online platform called Figma, where I could then play around and sort of move all the data around and code it and color it and different things.
So the other thing, sorry, I'm aware that Chris has got his hand up. Sorry, Chris, I've got these niggling. I just want to get these. So the other thing, I find it fascinating, by the way, and I was so the other thing was, so you do the questions specific to the activity, so it's specific to the opportunity that they're doing. Okay, and when you're asking these questions and you say, do you find it beneficial for your mental health, for example, and they say, I think most people say yes, it is. It would be. Do you have any weighting on that then? Is it really beneficial, or just somewhat beneficial, or kind of beneficial?
No, I actually didn't do it that way at all, because it wasn't a led question, so I didn't. So the survey that they had does have like a survey which is kind of questions like that. So do you agree, or to what extent? And then it would say, so they did do a kind of grading or like a sort of survey. That's what they always do every year. What I did is I actually asked the questions, okay, what are you getting out of this? And then from the basis of, so it was very open-ended, and I kept asking that question in very different ways until I got to saturation point of like the patterns that were coming out of how much, what's coming out. So actually, it was them that were telling me what was in it for them. So I didn't quantify any of it or did give way. I basically just found the patterns in what kept coming up and what was coming out every time I was doing all these different ways of engaging, if that makes sense. And then Keith, sorry, I just see this quick question and then I'll maybe go to Chris if that's okay. So in one location and multiple locations, no, I did it with one with limited time, and it would have been great to do actually more. So there's obviously quite a lot of health walks in Glasgow. So I worked with the main team and all the volunteers that do all the walks, but then I focus on one specific walk to actually do the deep dive into the benefit for them. Although sample size wise is pretty good percentually, because it's about 19% of the overall everyone involved. So I think in the context of, it was also validated by the volunteers and the staff there. So I think they would understand it as being relatively, this is how their walks go. But obviously you might also find more benefits from some other walks that might come out. And I guess that's the beauty of it being so emergent and bottom up that you can find a lot of different and rich sort of variety of things that are coming out, if that makes sense. Sorry, and then so Chris maybe, and then I see there's lots of people who have done the survey, so we can maybe go back to that in a sec.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to feed a bit more detail into my question, I suppose. What I do, Jo, and actually I take a very similar approach to you. In I work with a lot of charities helping them measure the impact of volunteering, so I guess that's bread and butter for me as well.
Yeah.
But what I'm finding is, I suppose that a lot of big organizations can afford to put me in a room a couple of days, loads of post-it notes and flip charts, and come up with a really good logic model, and that's great. Using, again, very similar models to you. I try to keep the academia to an absolute minimum, without sacrificing too much of the science, but actually we can do massive great theories of change and stuff, but actually the world of volunteering changes so fast that actually becomes quite academic anyway. But what I'm finding is small charities, which is, as we know, is the majority of charities, can do that themselves if they've got someone like yourself who can sit down and do that kind of research, but actually find it really hard both to find the time and the money and the model, and they certainly can't afford, to have a consultant in the room. So I suppose I've been trying to work on an online version, which isn't quite as good as the real person. But looping back to the conversations this morning, I suppose I found, so I've been working with a client in Arabia. We can replicate what you're describing, but actually use AI to be the consultant in the room to ask all the sort of what if questions.
Super interesting.
So that's beginning to take shape. But for me, the big point was just we all need to measure impact, and we all need to do it in exactly the kind of ways you describe. But I'm just conscious that so much of the stuff we just can't get to it.
Well, I mean, I do agree. And then I kind of have a counter, which is, can we afford not to? Because I think there's the status quo is we don't, right? But we say we have to, and then we say that it's important, but then we just don't do it. And I guess for me, it's a mindset shift, and I think there's loads of tools out there that can be used, and people are doing a lot more in it. But it has to be a priority. It just has to be a priority for the organization, because you don't have to pay someone external to do it. You can do it yourself, but then you would need to learn and do it, or find a way, find the right context for you. So, I mean, I totally understand and I agree with you, but I also kind of challenge, I guess, us, the whole sector, to say, well, actually, though, if it's a priority, then it's a priority. And also it will have an impact on so many other things.
I hear extra often on these conferences that my CEO doesn't get me. I don't get the money, the influence I need to make.
Exactly.
Absolutely agree, 100%. We can't afford not to do it.
I know. And so I'm going to, so I know, Stephen, did you have your hand up again? But what I did want to do, if it's okay, is just really quickly go to the results of this very quick poll, if that's okay. And just, oops, that's now, okay, so we've got 20 responses, which is really good. Can you see my screen okay? It's not very big, I guess, but oh, yeah, I'm definitely still presenting. That's okay. So basically we've got, okay, so we do have a kind of strongly agree mainly for it being important to ensure that the volunteers do see the impact. So we do mostly agree on that. And that involving volunteers could be or is useful if you already do it, and that having them define it actually might paint a richer picture. And thank you, because again, this is the first time I've done this. I just wasn't sure if this is, a one-off. Is this something you think is useful? Is it something we can build on to support the sector? So even just hearing 20 of you say that's encouraging. And then it's also saying, so there's a lot of you who, so some of you never use volunteers in capturing social impact, and then there's a mix, which is really good. So there's, sometimes, somewhat, some oftens, all the times and there's no one leads on it. So fair enough. I wasn't expecting that necessarily, but I've got two people that said all the time. Would the two people that said all the time be brave enough to tell us how they do it, or just, share any of their thoughts on that? If they're still here. And you can just, put your hands up, you can just jump in.
One of them was me. You don't want to hear from me again.
Okay. No worries. Thank you, Chris. Who else? Who was the other one? or maybe I'm putting you on the spot too much, so don't worry. If the person who did say that wants to share anything and also just wants to put it in the chat or speak later, no worries. Does anyone else who often or even somewhat involve the volunteers in capturing, showcasing impact, and how do you do it? Like, just give us a couple of examples.
So, am I on mute still? No. Okay. So we would have a different. We do case studies on a fairly regular basis. We have coaches in situ locally to sort of capture what's happening on the ground and talk to volunteers on a regular basis. We have as part of our staff awards, we have a Volunteer of the Year award, so that sort of links in. And this year, a little bit differently, we're having like a volunteer recognition, and it's not so much of individual volunteers, but collectively of what volunteering is and what that brings to the charity. And it's more about bringing it home to that this impacts everybody. And you are in, say, for example, we've got 17 centres. We've got volunteers in 15 of the centres, in multiple roles, doing all sorts of work, and probably in fact impacting everybody in this room. So it's trying to bring it to home. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you about earlier on, because you talked about values and developing the values based on some of the responses, but I was kind of, the challenge for me is trying to actually bring it the other way around, because what I'd like to do is link it more to the charity and the values of what we are as a charity. And it's, do you see what I mean? Because actually to embed it, and the challenge for me now is that, I mean, our volunteer program has been running since 2011, 2010, a little bit maybe beforehand, but I don't think it's truly embedded in the charity. We do have support, don't get me wrong, but it's not embedded at all levels. And what I want to see now is people understanding where it impacts, where it's happening, and why. And so what I was interested in, one is I think there's almost room for two approaches here. One, that little bit of I think that personal approach is so important. Being able to talk to people, understand, get that soft data, get that information, and you have to do that. If you don't do that, you don't know what's going on the ground, then you're never going to get what you need. But we also need some key indicators, don't we? Some key, right, how we doing? And what I found is volunteers never like to, if you're not there to nudge them, they will not fill out how was your opportunity. So Team Kinetic do this on the system. You have to a thumbs up for your opportunity. None of them want to do it. None of them want to complete. None of them want to do it. And no one wants to fill any of that stuff in. And I find out that's quite normal, it seems. And I'm like, it's the easiest thing to do in the world, isn't it? But they just don't want to do it.
Well, I actually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's just how we bring that to life, isn't it? And make it scalable. So for me, we would have maybe 9, 10 to 15 different types of role. And it's how you scale that information down to make sure it's transferable and consistent in line with your values, if that makes sense, because you want it to be in a situation where you're asking similar questions, which will obviously demonstrate impact, but be consistent for all of the different volunteer roles, because they are quite different as well. And that's a little bit of a challenge, but asking the questions: do you feel valued? Do you feel you're able to contribute? Have you got anything you'd like to add, or whatever? I think they're the same things, really, aren't they? It's not really about the product, is it? It's about how you are being treated as a human being. And do you feel like you're contributing as a human being?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, sorry to sort of jump in, and also because I realize there's a few more questions to go. So I just wanted to, if it's okay to respond. No, not at all. To respond really quickly, because I think just to explain, if it's useful, because you talked about the values of there is that element of what the organization is trying to do and what's coming up from down below, right? And what's the balance between. And so the way I did it in this particular case was to actually do a values-based evaluation of what the values of Glasgow Life were, and where this particular program was contributing to or not, and then brought together their values and the value that was coming out at the bottom, and then created the evaluation framework that had both. And that was done with Glasgow Life and with the staff, so it was very much designed for them to sort of say, okay, well, this is the values of our organization, and this is how it contributes to what the organization is meant to do. But then here is also then, the how it works more in detail at that lower level. And so I used it, they call it kind of abductive ways of doing coding data, where you do have a bit of a framework, which was the values, and that was values as in compassion, joy, connection, etc., that kind of values. And that was also sort of counter, analyzed against the values of the organization, but then it was the values, that the pattern that was coming out of the data. So it was actually technically both, and I think you can do that. And obviously this particular way of doing it was what worked for Glasgow Life, because they didn't even have an evaluation framework. So they didn't have anything that even said, this is what we do when we do this health walk, and this is how it works, and this is how it contributes. So it gave them one, but then it also aligned to the values of the organization as well. Just to sort of explain that you can, but I think you can also be quite creative and do it very tailored to the need of the specific kind of approach. And then, sorry, because there's a couple more hands up. Who else wanted to speak? Please jump in. We've got like 5 minutes left before I get told to shut up.
I'll let someone, I've got a question, but I'll let someone else jump in, whoever's got the hand up. Listed in. Yeah, okay, I'll carry on. Yeah, I don't think, I know about, I've listened to Will Watts before, and I don't think your approaches are that dissimilar. You were speaking before about the money type, you know, the economic benefits, which is what Will focuses on more. And I was thinking, well, do you think that's just because the organisations are, as a whole, like the councils and stuff, they're measured economically, how much money it's costing for their residents to be able to, and what things they're offering. So when you ask about mental health, you know, a measurement of how happy is the population is quite a hard thing to measure. But if you're measuring how much it costs to actually support people with mental health problems, there's definite figures on the table that they can measure it against. Do you think it's to do? Do you think it's to do with that? To do with the fact that they're measured economically, so that's why people look for that economic way to measure these things.
I would say that that's why I would kind of call it the economic bias, almost, in the sense that, and I think that's why it kind of runs, I would argue that it runs counter to what we value as a sector, right? Because our sector is not profit, right, in that context, right? So our primary focus is real social value, is the impact on a person, a community, and health and well-being. And obviously, I think that is not the same as saying, how much does it cost to sort of get people happy or to get people healthy, etc.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying I agree with it. I can understand why they come to that position of, okay, we need actual figures.
Like I definitely think it's a bias because money kind of rules everything right now, and like we put the economy first above everything else. And I think we're running the risk of doing the same by also putting numbers on our impacts. Like, so I think that actually, and I have a sort of, I guess, a bit of a provocative question, which is, was it even the government that asked us to do it, right? As in, are we actually responding to a real need, or are we just doing what we think that they want? So are we assuming that they want the numbers, or do they want the numbers? And the thing is, I don't think anyone's actually asked. And we're just maybe assuming that that's the case because, yeah, everyone kind of does numbers and it's a lot easier to do, and it's maybe really good to sort of make a case about billions this and yeah, great. But it definitely doesn't show the full impact. And I would actually say that actually is outside of our values. That's not the values that we hold in terms of being nonprofit and sort of the focus. So then if you measure economically in that space, you're not measuring against what it is you're actually trying to achieve. And I think that's the problem a wee bit. But yeah, it's not an easy one because everyone has very different opinions in this. But yeah, so I just want to check if anyone else wants to share. I see that Joanna Todd has shared that she captures data from different sources and is really interested in how to bring the data together and share it with volunteers. Yeah, definitely. I think actually sometimes, maybe you're totally right. Sometimes like you've got lots of data already. Maybe you don't really need more data. Maybe it's about how you package that data. How do you get that data in the right sort of format for volunteers? And that's why, for example, we with Glasgow Life, I chose to do something that was quite sort of zine photo book, so it had all the data and it was structured and it was clear, but it was also super accessible, and it wasn't academic, and it had a lovely sort of thank you note at the beginning to from the staff. It had lots of nice photos, so people really could see themselves in it. They saw themselves in all the things they had said. There was quotes and everything, but at the same time the whole structure was a validated set of qualitative data by everyone that was involved because we tested it with them. And so, you know, there's different formats. I don't know, does anyone want to share on that, add more? Or Joanna, did you want to share or talk more about your ideas on that in the last like minute or two that we have?
Yeah, it was just like we do what other people are saying. We do annual surveys. We capture data from different things. I'm based in Scotland as well, so I'm possibly more familiar with Volunteer Glasgow than others on this call might be. And we work with the Make Your Mark campaign. But it's once you have all that information, being able to share it in a way that actually your volunteers are going to be interested in, and that they're going to want to engage with, and not going to be like, oh, here's the annual survey, whatever, I'll fill it in, I'm not really interested. You know, getting them more interested and then possibly using that data to maybe even encourage new volunteers as well, because it is sharing the stories of volunteers, and the feedback that we get is that from people who are prospective volunteers is how important that information is in drawing people to volunteering, is sharing those stories. So I'm really interested in put after that, like, can we read the report? Can we see the questions that you asked? Because I'm really interested in that as well.
Yeah, no problem. So we can definitely share some materials, and I'm happy to chat with you in more detail if you want after. So my details will be in the. I think you'll share the PowerPoint, etc. And yeah, so I think we have to wrap up. I was still kind of showing on screen a little bit the results, and I think just finally, I think it's interesting, as we said, maybe last words, which is most people do surveys, and yeah, we have some case studies and some quotes, but a lot of people don't necessarily capture that kind of data, or maybe there's other ways of doing it, but there's definitely a gap here. Like, no one is saying they're doing, you know, qualitative research or impact evaluations or impact reports geared at volunteers, which is just what we talked about with Joanna, or you know, or observation, or very little also looking at group discussions. Now, obviously, this is just 20 people in this call, but at the same time, I think there is so many tools out there, and it's possible to do all these things at really low cost. I swear it is. But it is obviously, it's contextual, and it just needs you to find the right methods for you, right? So like, what cost, what budget have you got, what research have you got, who can maybe look into it, how can you use it? And I think it's just about making it a bit of a priority and just finding the right way for you, I think. And I definitely think that is possible, and happy to talk more and share more about it if you want to contact me to see if anything is useful. So thank you. And someone's asked, so keep that. I don't know, maybe I should pass back to Chris, because he's probably wanting me to stop now. And there's a
never, Joe.
question
Never.
for Chris, I think. Yeah.
It's super interesting. I was in Will's session book out the last 10 minutes, and I think, like I say, as was previously said by Steve, I think your approaches, if you can combine them together, helps create a multifaceted picture that really shows the different sides of value that you're able to generate from the kind of work that volunteers do. Sounds like you've got plenty of thumbs up coming in, plenty of people interested in this stuff. We will be doing more work, and certainly through the Team Kinetic Academy, it's going to be an area we're going to be looking at around social value and evaluation more broadly, and how we can support it at Team Kinetic. Joanne, a massive thank you for taking the time to prepare a session and present it to everybody. Sure, I would like to say thank you. Loads of little claps going up, great.